It is now my pleasure to invite to the podium our honored guest, Dr. John Quiñones, to deliver the commencement address.
Well, wow. Dr. Q now, right? Doctorate of Humanities. I am so honored. What a great day, a glorious day, despite the little rain we had here today, right? You did it, the class of 2018. Congratulations. Proud of you. Yes, you may have heard I host that TV show called What Would You Do? But today we know what you have done, and we're here to commemorate it and celebrate it with you and all your families. And what would John Quiñones do? Well, I would congratulate each and every one of you, and again, every single, because I know the families work so hard on this momentous occasion. I got to tell you, I'm truly humbled, very humbled to be up here, because if you had told me when I was your age, the students, that someday I would be up here giving a commencement address to this great institution, I would have laughed you out of the house. You see, the world never expected much of John Quiñones, and even today, the people who only know me from television have no idea the long, hard struggle that it took for John Quiñones to get to ABC News. And I want my story to be a lesson for all of you. I was born in poverty, in the barrio. You know, the barrio is the poor neighborhoods of San Antonio, Texas. And you know how some people say, we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor. We knew we were poor. We had an old black and white television at the back of the house, and we saw how the other side lived. To the outside world, though, I mean, I was a kid with dreams, but to the outside world, I was just another Mexican-American kid from the bad side of town, the world of violence, drugs, drive-by shootings, gangs. My father, as you heard, was a janitor who dropped out of school in the 3rd grade to pick cotton. My mom was a housekeeper. She was a housemaid. She scrubbed the floors and washed the laundry of rich folks on the north side of San Antonio. Believe it or not, I didn't speak English when I was 6 years old when I entered the 1st grade. In fact, they used to punish us in school for speaking Spanish in class. In San Antonio, the coach had a big old paddle with holes drilled in it for extra power and speed, and they would give us 3 spankings if they caught us speaking Spanish. I never forget my first day at school. My sisters and I, we didn't go to kindergarten or preschool, and this is before bilingual education, so we went straight to the 1st grade. And I'll never forget being there in Mrs. Gregory's class at Carvajal Elementary, little Juanito Quiñones, 6 years old. I'm sitting there sort of twiddling my thumbs because I don't know what the teacher's saying. She didn't speak Spanish, and I don't speak English. And at 10 in the morning on the first day of school, the school bell rings, and where do all the kids go? To recess. It's recess time, so they go out to the playground. Where does little Juanito Quiñones go? I walked home. I lived 1 block from the school. So I got home, I'll never forget, going in the door, and my mother, my dear mother Maria, God rest her soul, saying, Juanito, ¿qué pasó? What are you doing here? And I said to her in Spanish, Se acabó. It's over, Mom. I like school. 2 hours, and you're done? I think this is going to work out very nicely. She grabbed me by the ear, and she dragged me back to Mrs. Gregory's 1st grade class because she knew the value of an education, and she knew that was my ticket out of the barrio. But I also knew that my family was struggling, and I did the best I could to help out. So as an 8-year-old boy, my cousin and I, Joe, we were 8 years old. We shined shoes for 10 cents a pair of shoes on the streets of San Antonio and down on the San Antonio River. And we would go to all the cantinas, the bars, because the drunk guys didn't realize how much they were tipping you. And we made a killing. Until one night, we're coming home, and we got jumped by a gang. It was a tough neighborhood, and they stole all my rags and my shoe shine polish and the earnings from the night, and that was the end of my shoe shining career. But when I was 13 years old, my father was laid off. When I was 13, he was laid off from his job as a janitor. He wound up being the janitor at the high school that I went to. And we did what a lot of Latino families in South Texas had to do back then. We became migrant farm workers. My two sisters, my mother and father and I, we jumped on the back of these trucks with strangers, people we didn't know, in the back of these trucks. And we journeyed 1,700 miles from San Antonio to Northport, Michigan, near the Canadian border, where we picked cherries. It was the cherry capital of the world, they called it. And we picked cherries for 75 cents a bucket. And I remember having this little bucket strapped around my neck, teetering on the top of these ladders, looking over orchards and orchards of cherry trees. And it would take me 2 hours to fill that darn bucket with cherries. After we finished there, 6 weeks harvesting cherries, we followed the crops like all migrant farm workers do. And we went down to Toledo, Ohio, a little town called Swanton, Ohio, just outside of Toledo, where we picked tomatoes for 35 cents a bushel. And man, I was a champion tomato picker. I did 100 bushels a day. And back then, that was $35 a day. My father would do 130 bushels a day, and my sisters and my mother contributed to that. And we learned the value of the family coming together, right, in times of, difficulty, and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps to help the family. The great African-American poet Maya Angelou once said, "We all marvel at the beauty of the butterfly. We all marvel at the beautiful colors and the wings and how it metamorphs, right? Morphs into a beautiful butterfly. But seldom do we consider all the changes that a butterfly has to go through to attain that beauty." And I'm telling you, I'm no butterfly, but we went through a lot of changes. I'll never forget, being when we were picking tomatoes in Ohio, being on my knees at 6 o'clock in the morning on the cold, hard ground, looking at a row of tomato plants that for a young 13-year-old boy's eyes seemed to go on for miles and miles. That's what I had to look forward to that day, picking all those tomatoes for 35 cents a bushel. And there I was at 6 in the morning, and my father Bruno, looking down and saying, "Juanito, do you want to do this kind of work for the rest of your life, or do you want to get a college education someday?" It was a no-brainer. I knew I didn't want to do that kind of work. Ever since I was a little boy, I had a dream of someday being a TV reporter. But back then, there were very few people who looked like me or sounded like me on television, and no one believed in me except my mother, Maria. She was the one who kept pushing and pushing, encouraging me to dream big dreams and not to give up on them. She would say, "Mijo," because when I came back from picking tomatoes, I would go to my teachers and I would say, "How do I prepare for the SATs? How do I prepare for the ACTs? How do I take advanced placement classes in English, math, biology?" I wanted to go to college. And do you know what my own teachers in high school would tell me? They would look at me and say, "That's wonderful, John, that you have this dream of someday being a TV reporter, but we think you should try wood shop or metal shop or auto mechanics." Not that there's anything wrong with those wonderful trades. A lot of people make a good, hard living doing that, but I wanted to go to college. And my own teachers would do what people do on my TV show, What Would You Do Every Friday Night? They judged me by the color of my skin and the accent in my voice. But thank God for my mother, Maria. She was the one who kept pushing. She would say, "Mijo," my son, "Mijo, it doesn't matter that you have to wear the same clothes to school every other day. At least we wash those clothes, right? They're clean." She would say, "It doesn't matter that you have to take bean and tortilla tacos for lunch when all the other kids are taking their fancy bologna and white bread." Now we know beans and tortillas have more protein, right? We got the last laugh on that one. She would say, "It doesn't matter. What matters is what's in here, in your cabeza, in your brain, and what's in here, in your corazón, in your heart." So she was the one who kept me going and moving forward, and yet it was hard for me to see that. I didn't have any role models. No one in my entire family had ever gone to college, and no one except my mother and father believed in me. And so, I just kept plugging away, and thank God, there was a program called Upward Bound, right? And you have a program here called New Up, very similar. I wanted to go to college, and thank God the federal government had a program called Upward Bound, where they would give kids like me from the inner cities an opportunity to go to college, to spend, while I was in high school, I would get extra courses on Saturdays. And during the summers of my high school career, I got to live on a college campus. And, you know, that made all the difference in the world for me, because all I needed was a little inspiration and someone telling me I could do it. Someone saying yes. And there was that English teacher who saw the writings of my essays, and she also said, John, I love the way you tell stories. Have you thought about journalism? And I said, of course. I've been watching Geraldo Rivera all these days. Of course, he's my only role model. But you know, it was during the Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King, I'll never forget his words of wisdom. I remember him saying, when you're faced with adversity, you gotta have faith. And we Catholics know all about faith. He said, when you're first faced with adversity, you gotta have faith. And faith is taking that first step. It doesn't matter if you can't see the entire staircase, just take that first step. Because tomorrow, there'll be another one. And the next day, and there'll be another one. And my first step was trying to get rid of my Mexican accent, so I got involved in drama classes. I tried out for the role of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, and I got it. Maybe it's because no one else tried out, but I got it. And I got to experience being on a stage and enunciating to the back of the room, and I just kept plugging and plugging away. But it wasn't easy, because even after I went to St. Mary's University, even after I got my master's degree in journalism from Columbia, I couldn't for the life of me get a job in television. No one would hire me. I was depressed, and I was on the brink of giving up on my dream of being a TV reporter. But then I came to my senses, and I decided that I would not let those negative naysayers, you know, the people who wouldn't hire me in Texas, in Florida, in New York, I decided that I wouldn't let them win. I decided to force society to believe in me, driven by the words of my mother, Maria. Success is in your head. Success is in your corazón, in your heart. When the going gets tough, you gotta just keep pushing. So I kept knocking on doors, applying for jobs, and finally I was hired as a local TV reporter in Chicago, and that's where it all started. And it was while I was in Chicago that I did a story that I wanted to do for a long time about an issue that's still a hot-button issue today: immigration. Being Mexican-American from South Texas, even though my family's been there for 7 generations, by the way. I love it when people say, John, you're Mexican-American. When did you cross the border? We've been here hundreds of years, you know? I tell people I didn't cross the border crossed me. But I did a story, I went undercover, and I posed as a Mexican citizen trying to get into the US. And I found a coyote who, on hidden camera, a smuggler, they call them coyotes, for $300 sold me a fake birth certificate, a fake Social Security card, and he said, tonight I will put you on an inner tube and we'll float across the Rio Grande. Later that night, he did just that. I gave him his $300. He puts me on an inner tube, and I floated toward Texas across the Rio Grande, all captured on hidden camera. The value of diversity, right, of having a reporter who happens to be Latino. I don't think anyone else who's not Latino could have done that story. And I didn't stop there. I went to Chicago, because this was for a station in Chicago, where I got a job at a restaurant, where we had heard the owner of this Greek restaurant had 7 Mexican undocumented workers working for him, and he had not paid them in 17 weeks. And every time they complained, he would say, hey guys, you get to sleep here in the basement, you get to eat all the food you want, you keep complaining and I'll call immigration and have you deported. And by the way, that happens in America today. So I went there, posing as a kid who just arrived from Mexico. I was 26 years old. And I got hired. I spoke only Spanish. I wasn't dressed like this. I wasn't Dr. Q. I posed as just an immigrant who had just arrived from Mexico, speaking only Spanish, and he hired me. So by day, I'm washing dishes at this restaurant with a hidden camera. This was for the local CBS station in Chicago. And then at night, I went down there and I slept with the other Mexican workers next to the dishes and the silverware and the boxes of food. And I still wonder what they must have thought, because by day I was bussing tables with them at this restaurant. And at night I pulled out a little camera and I started interviewing them in Spanish about their story. And they told me how they were being held as virtual slaves. The next day I came back to work, this time wearing a suit, speaking fluent English, with a camera crew behind me. And I remember we had to chase the owner of that restaurant through the parking lot because he didn't want to talk to us. But the next day, the day after the story aired on CBS in Chicago, the US government moved in, they shut down the restaurant, they arrested the owner, and they got the Mexican workers the money they were owed and temporary visas to remain in this country while they worked on their residency. And I knew then that those are the kinds of stories that as a Hispanic journalist I could tell better than anyone. I see journalism, I call it the candle in the darkness. Imagine this room is pitch black. The electricity's out, it's the middle of the night, and we're all stumbling around to trying to get a way out. We can't find the exits. We can't even see our hands in front of our faces. Well, the journalist is the person, he or she, with the candle or the little flashlight, and they can shine it on the darkest corners of this room to illuminate injustice, to illuminate corruption and civil rights violations and human rights violations. I think when journalism is done right, those are the stories that we should be covering. And I loved it, and that's all I did. And I won my first Emmy Award, and then Central America was blowing up. It was the 1980s, and ABC News was looking for someone who spoke Spanish to go cover Nicaragua, Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, Cuba. ABC had a correspondent who was shot and killed on camera because he was a white guy from New York and he couldn't communicate in Spanish with the soldiers. So the networks in all their wisdom said, we should hire somebody who speaks Spanish to go to Latin America. And there I was in Chicago with my little Emmy Award for crossing the Rio Grande. And I was hired by Peter Jennings to cover that part of the world. And I loved it. I loved it. But the irony didn't escape me. Here was a kid who used to get punished for speaking Spanish in school, right? The coach had a big old paddle, right? They would hit us. And I wind up getting my dream job in network television at ABC precisely because I spoke Spanish. And I spent 20 years doing that, covering the world. And I remember working for Peter Jennings. He said to me one day, I had a big interview that fell through. And I wasn't going to be able to interview the president of Nicaragua, even though he had promised me that interview. And ABC was waiting for that interview. Suddenly, the president pulled out. And Peter Jennings on the phone said to me, John, this is going to happen again in your career where people promise you something and they don't deliver. He said, but young man, don't worry so much about talking to the movers and the shakers of the world. You know, the presidents of corporations, the presidents of countries, politicians. He said, don't worry so much about talking to the movers and the shakers of the world. Talk to the moved and the shaken. In other words, talk to the real people in those countries. And for 20 years, that's all I did throughout Latin America, and then for 2020 and Primetime Live. And along the way, I learned some valuable lessons. First, not that you must take advantage of every single opportunity that makes you who you are. And this message is for you students, of course. The fact that I was Latino, the fact that I was able to speak Spanish made me a better reporter. I also learned that so much of success, so much of making it, is a state of mind. Always keep reminding yourselves that you are worthy, that you are unique, that there was no one else in the world quite like you. And remember this, don't be intimidated when someone tries to put you down, to bring you down. They're just projecting their own problems and failings on you. Pay them no mind, ignore them. Instead, surround yourself throughout your lives with people who believe like you, who believe in you. Yes, you should persevere and you should work hard because in the end you will be better for it. But you have to envision yourself as a success. Envision yourself as a success. Cleanse your brain of any and all negative influences. I know it's not easy, especially right now. These are very divisive times in America. People being criticized and bullied for the color of their skin, the accent in their voices, their religion, or sexual orientation. This is a time when even dreamers, children who were brought to this country as babies, are being deported to countries they don't even know simply because their parents brought them here illegally so many years ago. Too many people in this country right now are talking about building higher and higher walls when we should be talking about building stronger and stronger bridges between our people. It's a no-brainer. You know, after hosting What Would You Do, which, by the way, is back on June 15th on ABC. Had to put that plug in. No, after hosting this show for a dozen years, I've learned that despite all the progress we've made in this country with regard to diversity and inclusion and race and religion, despite all the progress, and there has been some progress, we still have some work to do when it comes to accepting people who are different from us. You know, much of that divisiveness in this country right now and that ugliness stems from the highest levels in this country, from politicians, radio and television pundits, on social media. And that, I think, has opened the door for Americans to resort to their darkest impulses. If the president can say these things, so why can't I? The fact is, words matter. Character matters. And that's where you come in. You know. Yeah, it does. And that's where you, the class of 2018, comes in. Your generation gives us hope. We're counting on you to fight that bitter hatred and divisiveness. We're counting on you to make this a better nation, a more inclusive, a more compassionate America. As you move beyond this university, throughout your careers and throughout your life, be concerned about your character and not your reputation. Because your character is what really matters. That's who you really are. Your reputation, that's merely what other people think you are, and that is often flawed perceptions that they base it on, flawed perceptions and faulty assumptions. If you believe in yourself above everything else, then no one can stop you. And by the way, get away from those cell phones, okay? You know, someone once said that the reason we fear each other is because we don't know each other. And the reason we don't know each other is because we don't communicate with each other. Communicate, get to know people who are different from you, and you'll find out that we are much more similar than we are different. And one other thing, whatever profession you pursue, make sure it's not just a job, but rather a career for which you have a real passion. Chase that dream because there's a fire in your belly that burns for it. Choose a profession that you would work at even if you weren't getting paid for it. That'll bring you true happiness and satisfaction. And by the way, always know that money and material things alone are not going to make you happy. The love of discovery, the joy of adventure, and the satisfaction of helping others, making a difference in people's lives, giving a voice to people who don't have a voice, now that is the greatest reward. And toward that end, don't forget those you've left behind, your younger brothers and sisters, and those other kids back in your communities who may be lacking in hope, ambition, or enthusiasm. Go back there and be role models for them. Inspire them. You know, the great Martin Luther King once said that our lives begin to end the moment we stay silent about things that matter. I urge you, this class of 2018, never ever remain silent about anything that matters, because that would mean that you would lose one of humanity's greatest attributes, our sense of compassion. And finally, if ever the chips are down and you're feeling depressed with that dreaded sense that you're not going to make it in this world, remember this Mexican kid from San Antonio, Texas, who spoke no English, who shined shoes on the streets of San Antonio, who had to pick cherries and tomatoes as a migrant worker with his family. I had no money, no connections to anyone in power, but what I did have was a dream and a die-hard sense of perseverance. I had what we call in Spanish, ganas, the all-important willpower that I could muster and push ahead with that. If this little Latino kid could make his wildest dreams come true, then of course, anything is possible in this great country of ours. Congratulations to all of you. Now go out there and conquer the world, okay? Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. What a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.